Morning, Jesus uses the illustration of salt to start out with his education of those who are around him. And he says, if salt has lost its saltiness, what good is it? Today I want you to understand salt was extremely valuable at the time Jesus was teaching. Today, it doesn't seem as if salt carries as great a value. Is there anyone who has no salt at their house at all right now? Most people have salt. And if you didn't, you could go to the dollar store and buy it relatively cheap. It is abundant and prevalent, but it was not always so. In fact, in doing a little research on salt, I have learned the following things. First of all, kingdoms were built upon the taxation of salt. The Great Wall of China was built in part by taxing salt. The first great Roman road was built to transport salt. The word salary comes from the Latin word of salt, which has spun the phrase, he's not worth his salt. Because of the comparison of salt to salary, wars were fought about salt. Salt was the primary way that meat and other things were preserved in the ancient world. An army could not advance without salt because they needed salt to keep their meat to make progress. There was a great leader called Mahatma Gandhi in the 30s who marched to the sea in what was known as the Great Salt Protest. And he and many of his followers were beaten to a bloody pulp, which spurned the independence of India from British rule. And it was because Britain was taxing salt and made all of those of India purchase only the salt provided by Britain, when in fact it could be purchased or brought from the sea. So salt has this great value. And in fact, your body has a certain percentage of salt. When someone goes to the hospital and they need fluids, they're not getting pure water, they're getting salt water. They're getting what is needed for life. And so everyone who was listening to Jesus had a clear understanding of the value of salt. Salt in and of itself is a compound. What two elements make up salt? Sodium and chloride. Thank you. Each of these elements, sodium in and of itself is a very caustic element. Chloride in and of itself is dangerous to the body. But these two deadly things combined together form this great valuable thing we call salt. But Jesus says if salt has lost its saltiness, it is worthless. Then we hear Jesus go on and try to teach about light. Let your light shine before others. We actually hear the phrase that each one of you at your baptism heard repeated to parents and godparents. The assisting minister pronounces it here at worship. It is said, "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." We are encouraged to let our light shine. And then we hear Jesus talk about the commandments and love. Jesus talks about the commandments. He says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law and the prophets." When Jesus came to earth, he didn't come to get rid of those things from prophets and the Ten Commandments. Jesus rather says, "I have come to fulfill them." And then Jesus says, until the end of time, nothing will disappear from the law until all is accomplished. And then when he says, not even a stroke of a letter of the law, it refers to hyphenation, the way the laws were recorded. Written in Hebrew, jots and tittles are little dots and dashes that give meaning to the letters. And Jesus says even those things will never disappear until all is fulfilled. So it is all important. And then he warns us. Those who disobey the law and teach others to do the same will be called what? Do you remember what Jesus said? Jesus says you will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. To me, that's great news. It's great news because Jesus is signaling a great shift in the world of faith. He says, basically another way to say it is, those of you who fail and you have other people fail, you will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Pastor Rob would rather be least in the kingdom of heaven than great in the kingdom of hell. Are any of you with me? Yeah, think about what I just said. Least in the kingdom of heaven. Through Jesus Christ, this is what is given to those who hold on to the law so tightly and figure that is the only way. Jesus says, no, if you fail at this, you'll be least in the kingdom of heaven. That's a great place to land. But Jesus also says, if you follow them and teach others to do the same, you will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. But then Jesus closes our story today with this: unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom of heaven. And I think to myself, wow. Jesus has just said in one breath, you can fail the commandments and still be great, or at least in the kingdom of heaven. But Jesus says, unless your righteousness surpasses the scribes and the Pharisees, you shall not enter the kingdom. All of a sudden now we hear how you will not be in God's kingdom. And please follow me, because people oftentimes wonder, Pastor, where do you come up with some of the things you say and do? Why do you lead us in the way that you do? This scripture is one of the huge, huge components of my fundamental understanding of faith. Jesus says, fail the commandments, and you can still be in the kingdom of heaven. But Jesus also says, unless you surpass the scribes and the Pharisees, you cannot be in the kingdom. The scribes and the Pharisees were the leaders of the church, and their big problem was they thought everything was about what they did and how they did it. The scribes and the Pharisees taught that the kingdom of heaven was dependent upon what they do and what they understand and how they act. And that's not at all what Jesus wants us to know. Jesus wants us to know that he is the fulfillment of the law. He is love. It is not about rules, but there is this balance. If we lean too much to the scribes of the Pharisees, which is it's all about us, we shall not enter the kingdom. If we lean too much toward this idea of loving grace, then we live in what Dietrich Bonhoeffer called cheap grace. And we don't properly respond because of our forgiveness given to God. We don't respond, and there's the case where our light does not shine to others. Our salt is no longer good. I struggled with how does salt lose its saltiness. I had to consult a chemist. Marissa Dobelis is one of our dear members of this church. I confirmed her here. I am going to have the joy of doing her wedding soon. And I called her because she is a chemist. She's extraordinaire. She's going to be a PhD. And we were talking about salt and how it loses its saltiness. Salt is dissolved in water. But when salt is dissolved in water, it has a perfect suspension so that when we taste it, it still tastes salty. The only way for salt to be ruined is if other stuff is added to the mix. And it pulls away the sodium in the chloride. For example, I watched a chemical reaction on video, which was salt water. Other things were added to it, and the next thing you know, particles started to fall out. The salt was recombined with other things. Stuff that shouldn't be there was there, and it ruined the salt. I wonder if what Jesus is saying to us, if we live our lives in just the law, we are caustic and no good. If we live our lives in just grace, we are caustic and no good. I wonder if the law might be like sodium and the gospel might be like chloride. And when these two combine, the law and the gospel, we now find ourselves living in solution in the waters of baptism, so to speak, where we are what is needed in the world, where we are this valuable, valuable commodity, salt. Remember, kingdoms were built on it. Wars were fought about it. And it's because people did not know how abundant salt is. Salt is all over the place now. From the beginning of time in God's creation, the earth was covered with waters, so to speak, it says in Genesis. As the waters diminished and land was found present, salt was left everywhere. But people didn't know where it was. Now it is readily known where to get salt, how to get salt. It is not worth its weight in gold anymore. It is prevalent everywhere, just as God's love and grace is prevalent everywhere. Only perhaps in the beginning of time it was not as well known. And it took the presence of Jesus to come to talk about this balance of law and gospel. For what is the law without love? It is nothing but rules and a burden. Jesus says that is not our life. That is the scribes and the Pharisees. And if we live the law without love, then we shall not see the kingdom. But the other is true and important as well. What is love and grace without the law? Then it is chaos. Everything goes. There are no rules. And that is not true either in our church. What is important for us is to hold law and gospel together and not add extra stuff to it. Not add so much to God's law, which is to guide our hearts and our relationships and our faith, and God's grace through Jesus Christ, which is forgiveness for all things. We are not to add so much to it that it no longer becomes good through the waters of baptism. So today I want to encourage you to live in both the law and the love of God, knowing that perhaps that is how we are the salt of the world in the waters of baptism. Marissa encouraged me. She said, Pastor, salt can become denatured and recombined, but it is never irredeemable. You can continue to add water or other chemicals to come back to salt. I don't think there's any one of us who are irredeemable. I think through the waters of baptism and the way God works in and around our lives, we can be the salt of the world, holding together what may be caustic on its own, just the law, or caustic on its own, just the gospel, in a way suspended in the waters of baptism, that we are in fact one of the great gifts to the world. This is how my faith is informed. It is to hear Jesus say publicly and out loud, it is not about you, it is not about rules, it is about I, who have come to fulfill this law. And as we live in that combination, we truly are valuable. Even though the world now knows salt is everywhere, salt is readily available, salt is diminished in value because of its abundance, not for us as Christians. We live in that tension, we live in the love, and we share the story with others. Amen.